December 1944. Near Hattiesburg, Mississippi. The frost clung to the dead grass like ash on a battlefield. It was 37 degrees Fahrenheit and still dropping, the kind of cold that wasn't dramatic enough to seem dangerous, until your fingers stopped bending. A low mist hugged the muddy roads, and the pine trees stood like sentinels, unmoving, damp, watching. Through the fog, a truck engine sputtered and coughed as it rolled up the dirt path that led toward Camp Shelby, one of the dozens of POW camps hastily expanded across the American South as shiploads of prisoners kept arriving from the European theater. In the back of the olive-drab truck sat 12 German women, all wearing mismatched sweaters over their olive prison uniforms, salvaged from the camp donation bin. They looked like factory workers sent to the wrong war. One clutched a rolled newspaper stuffed into her coat for warmth. Another, barely 20, had sewn a red thread into the cuff of her sleeve so she wouldn't lose her place among the others. Her name was Helga Reinhardt. The truck braked suddenly. Mud splashed up and slapped the undercarriage. The gate of the vehicle creaked open and Sergeant Kenneth Doyle barked out, "All right, ladies, bakery detail, double time." Helga blinked. Bakery. The 12 stepped down onto a gravel path that led to what looked like an oversized barn wrapped in the scent of vanilla and roasted something. Something sweet. A smell that made no sense in war. It had no reason being there, next to barbed wire and M1 rifles. They were marched, though more politely than they expected, into a wide wooden structure with steam rising from an open ventilation hatch. It wasn't a prison. It was a kitchen. A real one. 3 mixers the size of beer barrels churned batter in rotating bowls. A conveyor oven the length of a small car glowed red-hot at one end. American women in spotless white aprons darted from station to station, folding dough, brushing butter, checking the gauges. Lined up on a rack, over 24 golden discs cooled on wire trays, pale steam curling off their surfaces. Helga whispered to the woman beside her, "Sind das Kuchen? Are those cakes?" "No," muttered one of the older POWs behind her, a woman with lines deep in her face and the eyes of a former cook. "Pies." The word landed awkwardly among them. "Pies." Doyle, seeing their hesitation, offered a smirk and said, "It's ice cream but hot." The women looked at each other, bewildered. This was a punishment. Inside the bakery, Private Molly Griggs, not more than 52, with red curls pinned under a kerchief, greeted them with a southern drawl thick enough to spread on toast. "Welcome to the 127th Field Bakery, ladies. Y'all'll be helpin' us prep holiday rations for the boys headin' east. And yes, those are pies. Apple today." She walked past them with a tray of sliced butter stacked like bricks. "You ever folded dough, missy?" she asked Helga, pointing at her with a flour-dusted finger. Helga nodded stiffly. "For strudel." Molly's eyes lit up. "Then you'll do just fine." They were not prepared for what came next. Not the sheer scale of it, 200 pies by noon, 300 by sunset. Not the efficiency, measuring scoops by weight, pans pre-cut with wax liners, ovens timed to the second. And certainly not the flavor. At first they mocked it, quietly, behind their breaths. They laughed when they saw canned fruit, when they saw margarine instead of butter, when they saw American soldiers spooning cornstarch into giant tubs as if baking were a science, not an art. "It smells like a sugar factory," muttered Inga, her nose wrinkled. "They even bake with gasoline," whispered another. But curiosity betrayed them. When Molly handed over the first slice, golden crust, bubbling apple filling, a sheen of glaze on top like glass, none of them refused. Helga took a cautious bite. Her teeth sank into heat and softness, sweetness and cinnamon. The filling collapsed and reformed around the tongue. The crust crumbled in layers. She froze. It wasn't just warm. It was warm like a hearth, like memory. Like something made not to survive war, but to end it. Helga blinked. It's ice cream, but hot." The laughter that followed wasn't cruel. It was the kind that broke tension, Molly winked. Told ya. The rest devoured their slices faster than any drill sergeant could have ordered. Inga asked for a second. Two of the women wiped their eyes, hiding tears behind the excuse of steam. Behind them, the ovens kept humming. The pies kept rolling out. And for a brief moment, in a Mississippi bakery wrapped in mist and barbed wire, 12 German women remembered something they hadn't felt since before the war: the sensation of being fed, not rationed, of being served, not searched, of being women again, not prisoners. The bakery detail wasn't a fluke, it was deliberate. Every camp had them, rotating jobs for POWs that matched their skill sets. Helga's name appeared again on the roster 2 days later. Then again. By New Year's, she was helping Molly cut the slits in the crust to vent steam. Apple pies must breathe, Molly had said. But it wasn't all cinnamon and laughter. One morning, the truck dropped them off early. The air was still black with night. The kitchen lights hadn't come on yet. As they waited outside, one of the guards lit a cigarette, and in the match's flare, they saw movement through a second building nearby. Not the bakery, but the meat preparation shed. Inside, 4 GIs in white coats were moving crates, boxes marked in bold black ink. Butter, milk, sugar. The same ingredients they used daily, only the quantity was staggering. 1 crate, 2, 5, 10. By dawn, over 100 pounds of butter were being offloaded. Helga whispered, "Is all this for soldiers?" The guard shrugged. Some for hospitals, some for rail stations, some for Europe. Europe, she asked. He exhaled smoke and nodded. Liberated zones. They send care rations. The same pies you're baking end up in France and Belgium sometimes. Inga frowned. We couldn't even get real bread last winter, and now pies in France. Doyle stepped out of the shadows then, rifle slung casually over his shoulder but his eyes sharp. Don't be fooled, ladies. War ain't won with bullets alone. And then he walked off into the fog. They didn't understand it yet, but America's secret weapon wasn't just in its tanks or planes. It was in supply lines measured in thousands of miles, in calories per soldier, in pies made by prisoners and shipped to strangers. A war machine with an oven at its heart. By spring, Helga could fold crusts with her eyes closed. She could spot a scorched edge from 20 paces. But she still hadn't figured out why the Americans fed their enemies like guests. That answer wouldn't come until the Red Cross inspection. And by then, it would already be too late for some of them to go back to the world they knew. The Red Cross arrived in mid-February, but the Germans had been hearing rumors for weeks. News passed quietly between fence posts, in line at the infirmary, or during language classes taught by old American volunteers who spoke better Berlin German than some of the prisoners. The rumors weren't about the war. They were about what came after. That the camps might be inspected, that names might be recorded, that the Allies were preparing for the long peace and needed to document who could be trusted and who couldn't. But when the black sedan pulled up with its flags fluttering, a Swiss observer, no doubt, along with a U.S. liaison, it was the men's camp they visited first. It was the bakery. Helga stood at her station, sleeves rolled to the elbows, smearing a cinnamon butter paste over 140 crusts lined on a work table. The pies were bound for a troop train supply depot. She glanced up as a tall, hawk-nosed man in a gray overcoat stepped through the swinging double doors, trailed by an American officer with sharp creases in his uniform and shoes that could blind a man. The air smelled like nutmeg and sweat. Flour dust hung in the beams of sunlight slicing through the glass windows. Sergeant Doyle stood nearby, leaning against a flour sack stack with his arms crossed. The Red Cross man didn't say anything at first. He simply looked, took it all in, then he pointed at Helga's table. "May I?" She nodded. He picked up a crust, examined the crimps along the edge, then took a small knife and sliced through it. The flake held. The inside was soft, buttery. "Who trained her?" he asked. Molly raised her hand from across the room. She came with skills. We just added a few Yankee tricks. The man smiled only faintly. Remarkable. Then just as quickly he pivoted. What's the caloric yield per pie? The army officer beside him replied instantly. Roughly 1,500 per unit. They're portioned for 6. Enrichment additives. Vitamin D powder in the milk base. Iron in the flour. Government regulation. The man scribbled in his notebook, nodded once, then turned and left as quickly as he'd arrived. No grand speech. No medals. Just a silent judgment tallied in grams and percentages. The women didn't speak for a full minute after he was gone. Then Inga broke the silence. We're not prisoners, we're ingredients. But none of them put down their rolling pins. That night, Helga sat on the cot in Barrack D2 with her back against the wood-planked wall, watching shadows sway as the ceiling lamp flickered in the wind. Across from her, Marta, once worked as a pastry assistant in Dresden, thumbed through a folded recipe card Molly had given her. I don't understand, Marta said, more to herself than anyone. Why share this with us? Helga didn't answer. She didn't need to. Because deep down, she had begun to suspect something none of them wanted to say out loud. That it wasn't just about feeding soldiers, or proving democracy's superiority. It was about memory, about reshaping it. If the only thing these women remembered of America was fences and rifles, they would go home bitter, hateful, still loyal to a dead Reich. But if they remembered cinnamon and warm crusts and laughter echoing through steam-filled kitchens, maybe, just maybe, the next war would never come. By March, the bakery's pace doubled. They weren't just feeding supply trains now. A new directive came in. Every liberated hospital in France and Belgium that housed wounded civilians or children would receive care crates, packed with medical goods, blankets, and pies. Over 800 pies, a week left Camp Shelby. But something else began leaving with them. Notes. Not official ones, not inspected, just slips of wax paper tucked under crusts, written in pencil, sometimes in shaky English. One from Marta read, I am from Dresden. I pray your children walk again soon. Please eat this warm. Another from Inga. This crust was made with hands that once served lies. I hope this helps undo them. Not all were so poetic. Some just said, God help us all. They never knew if the notes reached their destinations, but they kept writing them anyway. One day in early April, Helga was called to the back of the bakery where Sergeant Doyle stood with a clipboard. You're being transferred, he said. Her stomach dropped. Why? No reason given. Orders came through yesterday. Back to the main camp. He shook his head. No, north, a new unit, special attachment, classified. She felt the floor sway. She was led back to the barracks to gather her things, what little she had. One red cross-issued coat, a wool cap, a pencil stub, and a folded paper from Molly that read, Don't forget that heat rises, so always start baking on the low shelf. No signature, just the scent of vanilla still clinging to the page. The truck rolled out before dawn the next morning. The destination wasn't a camp. It was a rail hub outside Chicago. There, Helga saw it with her own eyes. A warehouse the size of a cathedral, rows of pies being boxed into steel crates marked Operation Nest. Nest. Inside, she was joined by 6 other women from various camps, all bakers, all German. They were told nothing. Each day they baked. Massive ovens ran 20 hours a day. Their station leader, a quiet woman from Boston with a Jewish surname and tired eyes, never smiled but always watched. One night when they'd finished early, Helga caught a glimpse of one of the manifest sheets. The crate number read, Nest 04, Paris, Jewish district. She understood then. These weren't just pies, they were answers, delivered hot, folded into crust, filled with apples and apologies. It was too much, too heavy. She dropped the spoon, sat down beside the mixing bowl and wept. The Boston woman sat beside her without a word. And after a long silence, she whispered, "Your crusts are better than mine now." Helga laughed even as the tears came. They were always yours. When she returned to Camp Shelby in May, the women surrounded her like a returning soldier. "What was it? Where did you go? Did they punish you?" She didn't answer. She only opened her bag. Inside were 6 recipe cards, fresh, each marked in red pencil with initials she never explained. And a tin. She opened it. Inside 6 slices, apple pie. Still warm. Each woman took one. No forks, no plates, just fingers and silence. And as they bit into them, sugar crust cracking under the weight of cinnamon, they tasted something they couldn't describe. It was more than food, more than heat. It was something impossibly American. Something that had no word in their language. And they knew then. They would never laugh at it again. By June, the pine trees around Camp Shelby had shifted from skeletal gray to blooming green. The southern heat returned with its full-throated humidity, curling the corners of paper signs and turning midday into a stifling test of endurance. The ovens in the bakery didn't slow. If anything, they roared louder, churning out peach pies now, then pecan, strawberry rhubarb by the 4th of July. Each scent became a seasonal clock that reminded the German women time was passing. But the war hadn't ended for them, not yet. Rumors came down like fog through the barbed wire. Berlin fallen, Hitler dead, Goebbels gone, but the guards never confirmed it directly. It was the way they started carrying their rifles more loosely, the way the loudspeakers played just a little longer at night, the way the chaplain skipped prayers for the fallen and started praying for those who will rebuild. Then came V-Day. They didn't hear about it from a soldier or a guard. They heard it from Molly Griggs. She burst into the bakery with powdered sugar on her apron and tears on her cheeks, waving a rolled-up newspaper in her hands. "It's done," she shouted. "Germany surrendered. The war in Europe is over." The American women cheered. Someone turned on a phonograph in the corner. Glenn Miller, trumpets. Someone tried to dance but slipped on a pie tin and fell laughing. But the German women didn't move. Helga stared at the flour on her knuckles. Marta sat down on a stool, her legs suddenly too weak. Inga said nothing, just folded her arms and stared out the window at the tall fences still standing. "What happens now?" whispered one of the younger girls, a teenager who'd never even finished secondary school before the war ripped her life open. They didn't know. What do you do when the cause that defined your life has turned to ash, and yet you're still alive? It took days before the first official word came down. They would remain in U.S. custody under Geneva Convention guidelines until repatriation arrangements could be made. Some would be sent to Britain first, others to French-administered camps. There were no promises, no timelines. But in the bakery, the pies kept baking. And something else happened, something subtle but seismic. The guards started leaving the door open. It wasn't formal, no announcement, but for the first time since their capture, the women stepped outside the bakery during breaks and sat on crates in the sun, watched bees hover over clover. They were still prisoners, but something had changed. One evening, Helga was invited, not ordered, to eat at the mess tent with the kitchen crew. She hesitated. "Is this allowed?" Molly shrugged. "Nobody said it is." The tent smelled like baked beans and cornbread. Not like the bakery. There was no cinnamon, no sugar. But the warmth was real. Soldiers from the logistics division sat shoulder to shoulder with POWs from Italy and Germany, eating quietly, no rifles in sight. Across from her, a soldier with a crew cut and a Texas drawl nodded politely and said, "I heard you make the crusts for the cherry pies." Helga blinked. "Yes." They're damn fine. She didn't know what to say. That night, as she walked back to the barracks under a moon half-eaten by clouds, she realized this wasn't a trick. This was what peace looked like. Not confetti, not declarations, but crust. And kindness. By July, a new camp initiative had been started, voluntary cultural immersion lectures for POWs preparing for repatriation, English classes, U.S. civics overviews. One day, they even brought in a professor from Ole Miss to talk about the American food supply system. He wore spectacles and a bolo tie, and held up a chalkboard like he was teaching schoolchildren. The U.S. produces enough wheat to feed half the planet, he explained, tapping on a global map. But it's not just about farming, it's about processing, packaging, transportation. A pie isn't just crust and apples, it's rail cars and refrigeration units and a whole supply chain that makes that flavor possible. He pointed at a photo of a train car with the words Pacific Fruit Express on the side. Refrigerated cars, he said proudly. They can take fresh milk from Wisconsin and get it to Louisiana before it spoils. That's why your pies don't taste like army bread. Marta raised her hand. In Germany, we had horses pulling potato carts. Our butter came in tins from 1941. The professor nodded. And in war, those differences get people killed. Later, Helga and Marta sat together, watching the sun dip behind the trees, thinking not about bombs or guns, but about butter. "Do you think they'll make us teach this back home?" Marta asked. Helga smiled, but only faintly. "I think they already have." In August, the pies changed again, not the crusts but the fillings. Now, the bakery was producing pies for the victory trains. These were locomotives that rolled from coast to coast with bands, banners, and returning veterans on board, celebrating the end of the European War, building morale for those still waiting to fight in the Pacific. Each train car had a dining section stocked with baked goods from different states. Camp Shelby's bakery supplied the southern routes. They didn't just bake. They packed, decorated. Some of the pies were boxed with little American flags on toothpicks. One day, as Helga was stacking boxes, she found one with a label she recognized. Victory Train Route Delta 3 Passenger, LT James Griggs. She froze. Griggs. Molly's brother. The boy who'd gone off to war before she'd ever met these women. She stared at the label. Then, quietly, without asking permission, she pulled a pencil from her apron and wrote 3 words on the inside flap of the box before sealing it. "For your sister." 2 weeks later, Molly pulled her aside after shift. Her eyes were glassy. Her hands trembled. "He got it," she whispered. Helga blinked. "What?" "The pie, the box. He wrote me. Said someone had written a message. Thought it might have been one of the bakers, but he figured out it was you." Helga's mouth went dry. "Is that all right?" Molly didn't answer. She just hugged her. Hard. No words, no orders, just arms and tears and the smell of powdered sugar. Later that week, the guards unlocked the north gate. It was unprecedented. The women were escorted, not marched, to the edge of the pine woods where a makeshift picnic table had been set up. Red checkered cloth, tin cups, cans of Coca-Cola packed in crushed ice. A radio played softly from a truck bed nearby. They were allowed to sit, no rifles pointed at their backs. And there, in the sweltering Mississippi dusk, Helga bit into something she'd never seen before. A wedge of warm chocolate folded in flaky pastry, drizzled with what looked like cream. "What is this?" she asked. Molly grinned. "Hot fudge pie." Helga stared. "It's ice cream but hot." The table erupted in laughter. It was the sound of something deeper than joy. The sound of survival turning into life again. They ate in silence, savoring the contradiction. Cold soda in one hand, hot pie in the other. And in that moment, under the chirping crickets in the southern sky, they weren't prisoners. They were women. They were bakers. They were human again. And no one could ever take that from them. The orders for repatriation came without warning. September 1945. A thin yellow sheet posted to the message board outside the mess hall. Just a list of names, typed in all caps with a time beside each. No explanation. No destination. Helga Reinhardt, 9:30. Marta Weiss, 10:15. Inga Bauer, 1100. The women stood shoulder to shoulder, reading it like an obituary. No one cheered. No one smiled. They all knew what it meant. America had finished with them. Helga folded the note quietly into her coat pocket. She didn't pack much. The same sweater she'd arrived in, now patched and washed 100 times. A tin box containing recipe cards, and a single photo taken 2 weeks earlier with the bakery crew. 12 women in aprons, arms linked, some smiling, some not. Sergeant Doyle in the back, unsmiling but present. Molly kneeling in front, flour on her nose. No one had told them to pose. No one had said goodbye yet, but they all knew the picture was for something they wouldn't get again. That morning, Helga waited at the camp's north gate with 3 others. A transport truck idled nearby, tarpaulin stretched tight over its frame. A Red Cross officer checked their names off with a clipboard. Doyle approached her with his cap under his arm. "You'll be put on a rail line through New York," he said. "Then a ship, British troop carrier, should reach Hamburg in about 12 days." Helga nodded, "And after that?" He shrugged. "Nobody knows, maybe a camp, maybe a job board, depends what's left standing." A long silence passed. "Sergeant," she said quietly, "do you think we'll be remembered as enemies?" Doyle looked her in the eye, longer than he ever had before. "I think people remember what they choose to," he said, "but you'll be remembered here for your pies." She almost laughed, almost. He handed her something then, a small package wrapped in wax paper. "Last slice," he said, "peach." She took it with both hands. Then the truck door swung open, and her name was called. She climbed up without looking back. The road from Mississippi to New York was long and silent. The train rocked through pine woods, swamps, tobacco fields, then through Tennessee and the Appalachians, climbing into cold that felt more familiar. The other prisoners barely spoke. The war was over, but something inside each of them hadn't ended. The ship across the Atlantic was cold, damp, and packed, but the Red Cross fed them twice a day. Hot bread, soup, once even apples. But nothing smelled like cinnamon. By the time she stepped off the gangway in Hamburg, Helga could already see the scars of the war that had ended in her absence. Whole blocks of rubble where cities had once stood. Children in wooden shoes staring at the Red Cross trucks like they were spaceships. Men with hollow eyes, not looking at the women returning but through them, like they were ghosts. The American officer handed each woman a stamped document. DUTSCHER KRIGSGFNGNER German prisoner of war released. Then he pointed. "Local transport depots there, that's as far as we go." Helga stepped onto the cracked cobblestone and looked around. No one waited for her. There were no cheers, no flags, just the distant sound of hammering and a cart rolling by filled with scrap metal and broken furniture. The pie box was still in her coat. She hadn't eaten it, not yet. She walked the streets of her hometown for hours. The bakery she once apprenticed in was gone, just scorched bricks and a half-melted iron oven door sticking out of the dirt like a tombstone. Her old apartment block was still standing, but gutted inside. Smoke damage blackened every window. No one recognized her, or maybe they didn't want to. By nightfall, she found herself sleeping in the corner of a church that had no roof. Rain dripped through the rafters, landing in broken pews. She unwrapped the peach pie and stared at it in the moonlight. Still intact, still golden. She took a bite. It was cold, but it didn't matter. The sweetness filled her mouth like a memory she hadn't earned. The next morning she began walking again, and with each town she passed, she began asking the same question, quietly, carefully. "Do you need a baker?" Most said no. But by the end of October, in a small town near Göttingen, a widow who had reopened a small cafe said yes. The flour was gray, the ovens were charcoal heated, the apples were bruised. But she worked anyway. And little by little, people began lining up. At first it was for bread, then strudel, then something new. She called it warmer Apfelkuchen Amerikanisch. Hot American apple pie. No one believed it came from a POW camp. But they ate it anyway. One day, an older man stood at the counter and, after finishing his slice, said, "I haven't tasted cinnamon this fresh since before the war." Helga smiled. "It's not the cinnamon," she said, "it's the heat." He looked confused. She clarified, "It's ice cream, but hot." And for the first time in years, she laughed. Word spread. By Christmas, she had apprentices. By spring, a letter arrived. It was from Mississippi. The envelope was plain, but inside was a photograph. The bakery crew, this time standing in front of a new sign that read Griggs & Co. Pies, S. 1946. On the back, written in looping script, "You're still with us, every crust we roll, MG." Helga folded the letter and placed it in the recipe tin. It stayed there for the next 40 years. The cafe became something of a legend, not because it was grand or large or famous, but because it never stopped baking. Through winters and recessions, through the Berlin blockade and the Cold War, through American tanks rolling through West German streets and Soviets tightening their grip in the East, Helga's cafe, simply called Ofen warm, kept serving slices of golden pie, warm to the touch, dusted with cinnamon and memory. By 1952, she was baking with proper butter again. By 56, she had an electric oven. By 61, the cafe had a radio behind the counter and a small card under the glass that read, "All pies baked in the spirit of peace." She never took it down. And the recipe, it never changed. She taught dozens how to make it, women who'd lost brothers, sons, husbands in the war. None of them asked what side Helga had been on. They just folded dough beside her and listened as she spoke about steam and weight and the right way to crimp an edge with a fork. "Crusts are like people," she told them once. "They flake under pressure if you don't rest them first." They laughed, but they remembered. In the early 70s, a traveling American reporter passing through Göttingen for a NATO feature happened upon the cafe and recognized the taste instantly. He was from Mississippi. He asked Helga where she learned it. She looked at him for a long moment, then said, "Prison." He didn't laugh, he wrote it down. The story ran in a Sunday supplement. "The warmest pie I ever ate came from a camp for enemies." It triggered a small wave of letters, veterans, former Red Cross workers, even a few names Helga hadn't heard in decades. One, postmarked Illinois, was written in thick black ink. "Molly passed 3 winters ago, but she kept your recipe taped to the fridge. Her kids made it every year at Christmas. Thank you for giving us that part of her." Signed, James Griggs. She wept reading it. That night she reopened the tin. Inside, still folded between the original recipe cards, was the yellowed note from Molly. "Don't forget that heat rises. Always start baking on the low shelf." She read it twice, then got up and made a fresh batch. That year, for the first time, she added whipped cream. Vanilla. Cold on hot. A contradiction. And it worked. By the 80s she had slowed. Arthritis nipped at her wrists. Her hands, once able to roll 100 crusts a day, now trembled after 5. but the cafe still opened, and the smell of apple pie still clung to the old wood counters. In 1986, the city erected a small brass plaque beside the cafe door. In this place, warmth defeated war. American-style pies have been served here since 1946 by a former prisoner who chose not to forget, but to bake instead. Tourists took photos, but the locals already knew. When Helga passed, it was late autumn, 1989. 1 month before the Berlin Wall fell. The cafe was closed for 3 days. On the 4th, the ovens fired again, run by her youngest apprentice, a girl born in '68 who had grown up folding dough at Helga's elbow. The pies didn't stop. They never would. That same year, the German government issued a quiet memo inviting former POWs to submit post-war contributions for archival recognition. The entry for Helga Reinhardt Reed: returned to civilian life, opened a bakery, helped foster cultural exchange through American-German recipes, promoted reconciliation through food. Nothing more. Nothing about Camp Shelby. Nothing about peach pies smuggled in wax paper. Nothing about letters folded into crates headed for Jewish hospitals. But her apprentices knew. And so did the people. Each year on the anniversary of the cafe's founding, they served free slices, just one kind. Apple warm, with a card placed by the window. It's ice cream but hot. And in that flavor, sweet, spiced, impossible to describe in words, they remembered. Not the flags, not the fences, not the orders shouted in camps or the silence of crumbled cities. They remembered the slice that changed everything. The one that tasted like forgiveness,